Okay, the Agricultural Revolution, a period of technological improvement and increased crop productivity that occurred during the 18th and early 19th centuries in Europe.
The Enclosure Acts allowed the wealthy farmers to keep all profits, whereas the peasant farmers were forced to give up their profits and land. The aristocrats started the Enclosure Acts because they thought that larger fields could be farmed more efficiently than small farms. They needed to keep the farming of crops up with the growing population, and they believed they could do this with the Enclosure Acts. The Jethro tool machine allowed farmers to increase the amount of crops harvested. This machine was a seed drill that allowed farmers to control the amounts of seeds going into the ground. It was a capitalistic answer to the problems created by the Enclosure Acts because before this, farmers didn't have control over the amounts of seeds going into the ground, but this seed drill allowed the farmers to control this. It is a capitalistic answer because the farmers want to have bigger and more efficient ways to do things, and Jethro's invention allows them to have this. It made farming easier and more efficient. Crop rotation changed the agricultural revolution because it increased crop yield, and they did not have to kill the cattle before the winter months, so there was better quality and quantity.
The Green Revolution is a large increase in crop production in developing countries achieved by use of fertilizers, pesticides, and high-yield crop varieties. The GE and GMO seeds / crops related to the Jethro tool machine because they made farming and harvesting easier and more effective. GE and GMO have a positive effect to the revolution because it can reduce the crop damage from adverse weather conditions. The names used to describe GM seeds, including GMO and genetically engineered, can sound threatening to consumers and create marketing disadvantages for products with ingredients from GM seeds. This creates a negative effect to the revolution.
After the 1760s, a gradual but continuing rise in the rates of industrial and economic growth led to Britain becoming the world's first industrial nation. Coal and iron played key roles in the Industrial Revolution of Great Britain. Coal was burned to get power and heat. There were very large coal mines in Great Britain, so it was a good resource to supply the heat and power. People used iron to make pots and railroad parts, so there was transportation and goods coming from it. Unlike early devices powered exclusively by water, these steam engines were powered by coal. This meant that factories no longer needed to be located next to sources of water. Another change occurred in the production of iron. Groups such as hand-loom weavers found their work opportunities eroded in the early 19th century, and their wages plummeted after textile weaving entered the factories. Before 1750, wool was the major fabric used to make clothing. However, cotton was the next big material that took its predecessor's place. The Britain government passed a law in 1721 banning the wearing of printed fabrics designed to restrict the growth of cotton and protect the wool industry. This was repealed in 1774, and demand for cotton fabric soon boomed. This 1721 law eventually...
Before the railroads were constructed, the time differences in separate countries were great as 4 or even 15 minutes apart. But when the railroads came about, they set a time standard in England so that all the railroads and steam engines ran at the same time, so everyone was running on the same time. The creation of the internet allowed news and gossip to travel faster for people to connect and share information with each other. This connects to the innovation of the railroads because during both people were able to communicate and interact with others. The steam engine acted as a game changer in the Industrial Revolution because it advanced transportation, factories, and inventions. The need for coal to power the trains and iron for the tracks and engines led to profit in those two industries, coal and iron. New middle-class investors placed their money in joint stock companies. Railroad construction created many new jobs. The lower cost of transporting goods decreased consumer prices and increased profit margins for industries.
Enclosure by the landed gentry restricted use of what had been common land, able to be used by all in the area. This loss of land availability took away the ability of small farmers to survive. Left without a way to make a living, farmers and agricultural workers moved to cities and tried to find work. The great stink was when London's sewage baked in the hot sun. The Parliament tried to ignore it by putting a mixture of chlorine and lime on the curtains. This idea didn't work, so they tried to move the entire government from the Westminster area. This plan also failed, and they had spent many days without a solution. After some time, Parliament decided to take action. They realized that moving the government would not stop the people from suffering. Within 18 days, Parliament created a bill, passed and signed it into the action that fixed the sewage problem in the River of Thames. Even though the Great Stink was a terrible thing, it helped to push the reform that had been needed for centuries. The sewage disposal was one of the few environmental improvements because they not only did Thames evolve to be one of the cleanest rivers in the world, but the implementation of a functioning sewage system to be aided in the elimination of several waterborne illnesses that had plagued London for centuries.
Long working hours, low wages, cruel discipline, fierce systems of fines, accidents, health, and parish apprentices are some working conditions in the factories that weren't pleasant for workers. Some bad working conditions in mines that made life not pleasant for workers were that many recurring accidents that would happen frequently in the mines. Some conditions in the city that made life not pleasant for city dwellers were overcrowding, limited houses, and pollution. The Combination Acts of 1799 made it illegal for workers to get together and fight for higher wages and better working conditions. They passed this law because there were no laws to regulate them. Since only wealthy people in Great Britain were eligible to vote, workers could not use the democratic political system to fight for rights and reforms. With the passing of the acts, it made it illegal for workers to unionize or combine as a group to ask for better working conditions. We connect this to modern-day working conditions because now we have unions to protect our workers' rights.
Collective bargaining consists of the process of negotiation between representatives of a union and employers in respect of the terms and conditions employment of employees. Some industrial revolution laws that protected the worker rights were the Health and Morals of Apprentice Acts, factory apprentices only, a maximum 12-hour day, good accommodation, and medical treatment. This law was not enforced. The Factory Act of 1819, a maximum 12-hour day. No child under the age of 9 was able to work. This law was not enforced, and the Factory Act of 1833, no child under the age of 9 was able to work. Children between the ages of 9 and 13. 48 hours a week must go to school part-time. Inspectors made sure these laws were obeyed. Robert Owen bought 4 cotton mills in a small town in New Lanark. Owen focused especially on education and children. He would not allow a child under 10 to work in his mills. This is unique and special because he really cared for the children and also disallowed physical punishment towards young children. At this time, this type of treatment was very uncommon. It showed that he could break away from the social norm, and he was successful by treating people the right way.
A person could work a shift of 12 to 16 hours. The same person could be asked to work this grueling shift 6 days per week. Many of these factories were also dusty, unventilated, and sweltering hot in the summer. Conditions in the coal mines were hazardous as well. Usually men hunched up in cramped tunnels that were only about 3 to 4 feet high, dug coal and placed it in carts. Then small children or women would push the carts to the surface. Coal miners were faced with damp, cramped conditions, along with the danger of cave-ins and toxic gas. Many children who worked the mines had long-lasting health effects, such as lung disease and stomach growth.
The deplorable working conditions in early industrial Europe led to a quest for change. Workers were among the earliest groups to band together in an effort to gain rights. Skilled workers of many crafts began to form trade unions. These organizations attempted to limit the number of people who could enter into the trade and negotiate for benefits from employers. These early trade unions were only concerned with better conditions for their own particular trade. Some unions organized strikes to achieve their goals. Ultimately, these early industrial unions paved the way for the labor unions more familiar with today. Overall, the Industrial Revolution was a good thing. We now have trade unions, labor laws, advanced technology, and better working conditions.
These revolutions made our world what it is today. And that's a wrap.
The Industrial Revolution occurred between the 18th and 19th century. It changed how many people lived their everyday lives. Things such as how they communicated, to how they traveled, to even how they washed their clothes began to change. As more inventions were made and more jobs opened up in the industries, people began to leave the rural areas that consisted of mostly agriculture and move to the urban areas that consisted of mostly industries. With more industries, that meant more natural resources were being used up at extremely high rates. Also, with more industries, it meant there was a higher need for cheap manual labor. Women and children were often hired and received very little pay. Children as young as 8 began working, and the work conditions were often harsh and poor. The Industrial Revolution changed many lives, and without it, our lives would not be the same and would not be as advanced as we are today.